Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. A few weeks ago, I had the privilege of welcoming Dan Slater to the show to talk about his latest book, The Incorruptibles. The book tells the story of the Jewish underworld in New York in the early part of the 20th century. Slater has written several books, including Wolf Boys, which is currently being developed for television. We held our conversation over Zoom, and we did have a few technical difficulties, but I think you will still enjoy the conversation. Welcome back, everyone. With me today is Dan Slater. He is an author whose work has been published in The Atlantic, Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal. He is the author of several books, including the topic of today's conversation, The Incorruptibles, A True Story of Kingpins, Crime Busters, and the Birth of the American Underworld. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. So let's dive right in. How did you kind of first discover this complicated, fascinating story?
I first discovered this story in a way that I have discovered other stories in the past, which is through another project. I was working on a magazine story in 2017, 18, 19. It was a contemporary story about a gang of violent rabbis who had been beating up husbands in their community who refused to give their wives a religious divorce. In the Orthodox religion and the culture, the woman is bound to the marriage according to the Bible. And in order to be released, the man has to deliver a contract called a get. And there are inevitably some guys who don't want to give the get, even when, by all appearances, the situation calls for it. So these rabbis had kind of anointed themselves like the men who were going to go around and enforce the get rule, because if you don't have people like that, the rule isn't workable. So anyway, these rabbis were going around beating up these husbands. The FBI finally got wind of it after they'd been doing it for years and years and years and busted them. With an undercover agent posing as a wife in need of this service. And so I was working on that story for a long time, thinking or hoping that it might become a book. It did gravitate to this shorter magazine format, but I was doing kind of book level research, a lot of reading. And I was reading about the history of violence in the Jewish community, going back as far back as I could find. And I kept returning in my research to this period in New York City prior to World War I, when there was a ghetto in the Lower East Side where all of the Eastern European refugees were arriving. And it was the most densely packed area in the world at that time. And there was a big underworld there. There was a lot of crime. So there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of crime, and I was introduced to that world. And the more I read about it, the more I kept seeing this name pop up. And it was the name of a guy named Abe Schoenfeld, who was a kind of documenter of the underworld. And eventually he became more than just, a chronicler of it, and he became a crime fighter. And so that was the outline. Those were just the tidbits that I found in footnotes. And I wanted to know more. And so that was the seed, that was the genesis of The Incorruptibles. And it sent me on a 6 or 7 year path of where we are today, of publishing this book.
Yeah, the story is so incredibly detailed. And to your point, you found this in kind of researching the Jewish violence. And so, when people think about organized crime, right, most think of Italian immigrants. So how does this narrative kind of offer a different take?
this narrative offers a different take that was surprising to even me because I was born in 1977. I grew up on The Godfather and Goodfellas and Martin Scorsese and these incredible storytellers that are part of our life. And I bought into the same thing. I was like, the mafia is the mafia. The mafia is where it all began. And it was amazing to me to find out that although something called the mafia did exist in lower Manhattan around, as early as the year 1900, it was not the dominant underworld in terms of vice peddling. The dominant underworld of the time was the Jewish underworld that was based in the Lower East Side. Now, there was crime, plenty of it, among other ethnicities in the city. There was black crime. There was even a group of French pimps who operated, etc. But the Jewish underworld was huge, and because of anti-Semitism, it got a lot of attention. Some of the attention was justified, some of it was overblown, and there was an organization of it that did make it unique. There was, for instance, a fraternity or a union or a corporation of pimps, of these Jewish pimps, who would gather at a cafe on Second Avenue where they did business with one another. The gamblers had their own organization that would pool their power, pool their money in order to lobby politicians for certain rights, like the right not to go to prison when you got caught, for instance. And so there was like an organization to it that really did precede what we were talking about, like the heyday of the Italian mafia in the 1980s or the cartels of Mexico now. So as someone who has been interested in that subject throughout my writing career, I was fascinated that, hey, my own ancestors, my own people were kind of the originators in some sense. And so wanting to explore that was irresistible. Yeah.
And you have several characters throughout the book, and one of the main ones is Arnold Rothstein. So, who was he, and how did he influence the criminal underworld of New York?
Rothstein is a fascinating figure. Again, just to go back to my own experience, when did I first become, aware of a guy named Arnold Rothstein? It was in the 80s when I was a kid. I was a huge baseball fan, and one of the first when I started to read adult nonfiction books, the first real category that I became interested in was baseball history. And I read biographies of Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays and all of the greats. And I could tell you everything about the 1927 Yankees, for instance. And one of the big events in baseball history was the alleged fixing of the 1919 World Series. And when I was 9 or 10 years old, there was a great movie called 8 Men Out that came out. And it was a period drama about the fixing of the 1919 series. And in the background of the story, there's this shady figure named Rothstein, and I forget who he's played by. I think it's Murray Abraham, who doesn't look anything like Arnold Rothstein. Has nothing to do, but whatever. He's like ethnic looking, so he plays the Rothstein figure. So that was when I first became aware of Rothstein. And then I saw him depicted in a couple other pop culture items over the years, like Boardwalk Empire. But when I started to look into the history of this book, the early 1900s New York, he was a guy that you'd see all over the place. And he had been born in 1882. He was born in the Lower East Side, but he was kind of not of the ghetto world because his ancestors, even though they were Russian, they had arrived a bit before the massive immigration of the Russian refugees, the Jewish refugees. They had come back during the time of the German Jewish immigration in the 1840s. So by the time Arnold came along, his family was pretty well off. And even though he was born on the Lower East Side, his family moved all over the city. They eventually settled in a brownstone on the Upper West Side. And but Arnold wasn't into going to school, going to synagogue. He liked to be on the streets. He liked to gamble. And when he was a kid in the 1890s, there was a lot of that. The city was wide open. So when he left his house and walked to school, I mean, he'd walk down blocks and there were games of, dice just kind of spilling out of the storefronts. And he loved that world. He was very good at math, even though he hated everything else in school. He could calculate odds and like a flash, and that's what he wanted to. He wanted to be out there, and he loved risk. He was addicted to risk, and as a result, he had a very complicated relationship with his father. They become estranged pretty early on, and Arnold kind of goes off on his own and becomes a gambler, and that's how his story begins. And he has many, many years of operation in that sort of New York City underworld before we even get to the World Series of 1919. And it was interesting for me to learn that the World Series fix, which he was allegedly involved in, and I have my own theory for what his involvement was. That was just like one of many, many fascinating things that he was wrapped up in. But he ultimately becomes much more than a gambler, much more than a casino owner. And when I said earlier in our conversation that the whole world of organized crime really begins with the Jewish community during this period, Rothstein is really kind of the avatar of that. And you really don't see the rise of the Italian mafia as we know it today until after Rothstein dies. And
Yeah.
there was a reason for that.
Yeah. And you have touched on this and kind of talking about how the Jewish underworld was really the kind of the commanders of the vice criminal underworld. Are there other ways that the Jewish immigrants kind of changed or influenced the world of organized crime in New York?
Well, I would say that their history played a big influence, which doesn't directly respond to your question, but I feel like it's important to address because the last thing I want to convey to people is that, the Jews just love crime. One of the things I researched heavily was like, where did this all begin and why? And I went back and back and back in time as far as I could, and finally get to the money lending laws that were established by the church in the 11th and 12th century. And that was when the Christians got together, the monks who kind of made the laws for that religion said, we need a law that's going to galvanize people into our religion. If you're going to be a big, massive religion, you need a set of laws that your people are going to abide by jointly. And so they came up with this anti-money lending law because they thought, as many earlier philosophers had thought, that lending money to your brother was inherently immoral, even if you didn't take, any interest on it. And so they passed this anti-money lending law, but it was a weird time to pass that law because at the same time they were passing that law, there was another religion that was sort of overtaking the world, and that was the religion of capitalism. And what do you need for capitalism? You need money lenders. You need to have a credit system. And so they were caught in that dilemma. Okay, we're going to ban this thing, even though we know it's something that everyone needs. How's that going to work? And the answer was, well, we'll give that industry to the Jews to manage because they've already sold their souls. So they can be the immoral ones. And that was like quite a decision to arrive at. And that decision resonates down through the centuries to where we stand today. Because what is our stance on narcotics today? We have a country that, consumes like 80% of the antidepressants in the world, a lot of illegal narcotics, and yet we ban all this, knowing that it's still going to be used in large amounts. And we know that someone's going to have to supply that market. And we know that whoever's going to supply that market will be the people who are the most desperate, who are willing to take the risk. And so that was something that we kind of all know today. But it was fascinating for me to go back in time and see that this was so much older than what I had imagined. So that doesn't answer your question at all. But I just really wanted to get that in there because I feel like it's the necessary foundation for this whole discussion.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate the extra context, and I think it really kind of helps frame the story. And we talked about Rothstein and the criminal side of it. Well, one of the other main characters and kind of counterpoints to the story is a man named Abe Schoenfeld. And so you've kind of touched on him a little bit in an earlier answer, but again, who was he and what motivated him to become a reformer and what impact did he have?
Yeah, Abe is the character that my story or that the research for my story began with. He was the first figure that I kind of discovered, and why that will be apparent in a minute. But Abe was born in 1891, and he was born to Eastern European Jewish immigrants on the Lower East Side. He was born in New York, and his father was a guy named Mayer Schoenfeld, and his father was a big reform figure. His father was a very sort of magnanimous person, a well-known person who started off life as a tailor. He worked in the garment industry like so many people on the Lower East Side did. And he worked in the garment industry during sort of the worst period of sweatshops where there were no labor laws, there was no minimum wage, there were no limits on hours worked, there were no factory regulations for safety. And he was one of the first labor leaders. He was one of the first people to step out and to galvanize the garment industry workers and get out there and go on strike. So when Abe was a little kid, the world he was living in was having this father who was like organizing, massive labor strikes on a kind of scale that no one had seen before. The first labor strike in 1894 that his dad led was 15,000. A couple of years later, it was 45,000. So he was a magnetic figure who was a real leader. And ultimately, those labor strikes didn't achieve much. At the best, they would achieve sort of a temporary improvement in the conditions of laborers in the garment industry. And then his father moves on to new areas of reform. And around 1900, 1901, his father moves on to vice as his area of reform. And he pivots from kind of a social reformer or a labor reformer to a vice reformer, someone who wants to fight all the Jewish prostitution that people are starting to see on the Lower East Side. And so now Abe is 10, Abe's a teenager, and now this is the world that he's living in. The ghetto that he was born into is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And he follows his father into the world of reform, but as a kind of, an underworld reformer. And when he's doing that, it seems very unlikely that he or anybody else is going to have any success with that. But we see things begin to change. And soon he is getting opportunities that he never would have imagined.
And another character that I personally was a little bit fascinated by was the individual Tony the Tough and kind of what happened to her. And so can you talk a little bit about like how her story really helps us understand the impacts of that growing criminal economy of the period?
Yeah. So Tony the Tough, whose name was Antonia Rolnick, is a fascinating character. We meet her when she is a teenager, and she and her best friend Lily have both dropped out of school in 8th grade, as was typical of that time for Eastern European Jewish refugee gals. Most of the garment industry was comprised of these people. You can't really barely call them women. They're, 14 to 17 years old. And they accounted for something like 70% of the industry. And, it was like that or poverty. So there was, meanwhile, this big underworld that was sort of alluring for some people. And the plight of a lot of those young women was, do I continue to slave away in this factory, or maybe there's this easier route? And what made that whole dilemma more stark was that you had a big industry of sex traffickers who were out there offering inducements or trying to persuade you to get into the business. They'd show up at dance halls. They'd show up at department stores where you worked, and they would pose as a film agent saying, "Hey, we can get you a role on screen and all this stuff, or we'll take you to the dentist and get your teeth fixed." So Tony was caught in that world, and she became the kind of person who we don't really hear about in the history books. Like the Clara Lemlicks are the girls we're more likely to hear about. They were sort of the brave ones who became the union leaders and, the strike leaders. Tony is someone who kind of went the other way. And so she's really important because we're going to follow her on this unimaginable journey that she takes through the Jewish underworld, first as a prostitute unwittingly, and then later voluntarily. And then we're going to follow her through a bunch of other areas of it as she sort of, crosses back and over again the line of being part of the underworld and being a vice reformer. So yeah, she's a fascinating character, and she's a character who I didn't get out of a book. She'd never been written about. She was a person who was in the archival papers, who showed up in unpublished writings, trial transcripts, newspaper coverage, and it's for that reason that I'm maybe most fond of her as I am of any of the the characters in the book.
Yeah, her story definitely resonated with me. I mean, I think all of the characters you flesh out, and there's so many. I have one more that I'm going to ask you about before I move on. But for me, it was it humanized the experience in a different way of just watching this young girl kind of be corrupted, and how did she navigate that, and how she kind of went back and forth. So, very, very good character, and I'm glad you found her. And so the last person I'm going to ask you about, because again, there are so many characters in this book, but the last one I'll ask you about is William Gator. So who was he, and why did he stand out from other politicians of the period?
William Gaynor was another incredible character who, again, I had not heard that name before I started doing the research for the Incorruptibles, and then he was all over the story. He was a lawyer and then a judge, and then he got into politics, and he was elected mayor of New York City in 1909. And he was super charismatic, partly because he was genuinely independent. The parties would all try to kind of make him their own, but he would refuse to be part of a party. And he was very intelligent, and he kind of said whatever he wanted to say. And he thought that the newspapers were all staffed by a bunch of criminals who would write lies and whatever they wanted, which was partly true at the time. One of positions was he was very against reform of vice because he saw it kind of for what it was, which was at least partly an attempt by the wealthy to pass laws that were hypocritical, that outlawed things that they themselves did. And they passed the laws in order to have an element of control in a world where they felt they were losing it to immigration, to women becoming independent and getting the right to vote and going out in the workforce. So he was against that. However, his city spins out of control in the summer of 1912, and he is put in a position where he needs to re-examine some of his own pieties. And he decides that if he is going to pull through this moment, he needs to partner with reformers who approach him. And that is when the story that's told in the Incorruptibles, I feel like, really starts to gain momentum, and what eventually gives Abe Schoenfeld these amazing opportunities.
And as is true with most crime stories, nothing lasts forever. What happened to prompt the downfall of the Jewish underworld?
It was a confluence of factors. certainly the Vice Crusade that is at the heart of the book plays a big part in eradicating vice in the underworld on the Lower East Side. However, it is certainly not the only thing. There were other things happening, like success in this amongst these particular refugees and immigrants. They were going to college. They were flooding into NYU and Columbia and eventually to Harvard and to beyond. And they were moving out of the ghetto. After all, they did have this garment industry that, although it's hard for us to imagine now, it was an industry. Now when everything is produced in China or whatever with chemicals from God knows where, they produced like 80% of America's clothing, all in this one little neighborhood in the city. So they did have that legitimate overworld business. And when you think about the ghettos in America today, and if you said the word ghetto today, I don't think anyone would associate Jews with a ghetto, even though they literally invented the term in the 1500s. But where else could you say that was very unique about that period? They were able to create their own thing, even in a world of marginalization and a world of anti-Semitism that was getting worse and worse and worse. And it might have been partly that success that contributed to that anti-Semitism getting worse and worse and worse.
And, I've touched on this a couple of times. This book is incredibly detailed. You talk about so many fascinating people and introduce us to a whole new world of characters. I can't imagine there was much left on the cutting room floor, but was there an anecdote or a part of the story that you really, really loved, but you just couldn't include that you want to share with us?
I'm sure there was. Okay, there's one episode. Well, first of all, there's something like 75 pages of endnotes in the book, which I spent about 4 months working on after the book was done, after the main narrative was done. And because I had so much research, and you're right, in order to create that propulsive, hopefully page turning narrative, you got to cut more than you keep. And so those endnotes were a chance for me to go back through all those materials and pick out the gems that I couldn't include. So I'd say 99% of the best stuff did make it into the endnotes. And the endnotes are written in a prose style that makes them hopefully readable. It's not just like a line with a citation and the title of a book. It's like actual extra narrative, scenes that didn't make it in, subplots, etc. However, there was one thing I couldn't get in, and that was that toward the end of the book, Arnold Rothstein and his wife their sort of marital difficulties are starting to finally come to a head after a long period of rockiness. And to all outward appearances, to any observers, like this relationship is probably not salvageable for many, many good reasons. But in his attempt to save it, Arnold suggested that they both go see a psychologist by the name of John Watson, who was the founder of behavior. I believe it's called behaviorism. And it was one of the first movements in psychology. And it dealt a lot with men who marry women because they want like a mommy figure. And this was amazingly very much Arnold's situation with his wife. And although not a lot is known about what happened when both she and Arnold went to see John Watson individually and maybe also together, one can only imagine what happened in those sessions. And it was a lead I never took up. Did Watson leave an archive somewhere? I doubt that, he left his patient notes in there. What we do know is that in Carolyn's memoir, she said that Watson did ultimately advise them to separate. It was not going to work out. Yeah. But none of that made it into even the endnotes. So there it is. It's the one thing I can.
Extra tidbit. I love it. And now, where should people go when they finish your book and they want to learn more about this topic?
Well, that is a great question. I read so many books as research. I'm hopefully going to be doing a piece for the Wall Street Journal on what I felt were the best books on this subject. I hope that ends up happening. If it does, that will be a great place to go. But you have given me an idea. Hopefully, I'm going to do a documentary
Hmm.
uh, based on the book. While one of the amazing, there were so many incredible sources that I was able to dig up while working on this book, but one of those sources that I never imagined finding was this incredible archive of photographs
Hmm.
that was part of the archive of a photo news service called Brown Brothers that opened up in New York City in 1904, and it ran strong for a few decades and then shut down. When it shut down, it had about 1 million images that were beautiful images taken at the sort of dawn of photography, and they were stowed away in a warehouse somewhere in New Jersey, and they just sat there. They were passed down from generation to generation from the descendants of the people who had started this photo news service. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, that whole archive was sold to an auction house, um, for a large amount of money. And the auction house had the idea of, okay, we're going to go through this whole warehouse and we're going to put the images up on eBay individually. So about a year or two after I started working on the book, I discovered this on eBay that every week there'd be like another 400 images that were put up for sale that you could bid on individually. So I was able to acquire nearly 1,000 images,
Wow.
and these have never been seen before. They've been sitting in a warehouse for almost a century, and some of them were published in newspapers or magazines at the time, but for the most part they'd never been seen. So 60, I believe 68 of them are in the book itself, the hardcover, and my hope is to use hundreds of them in some kind of documentary, but that is still in the works.
Okay. Well, speaking of then, where should people go when they want to learn more about you and kind of follow your work and find out what else you're working on?
I lately, after sort of ignoring it for years, am now just recently more active on Instagram. So my Instagram handle is at by Dan Slater. And partly because of all these photos I'm finding, Instagram is becoming a cool platform for showcasing some of that. And I do put up a lot of book recommendations there, particularly the books that I'm reading for a project. I was recently involved in developing a series about the rise and fall of the Third Reich that premiered on Netflix last month. And in the course of working on that project, I, of course, had to read a lot of books on that subject. So when I'm working on something like that, I'll stack the books up, I'll put a picture, and you can get a sense of what I'm doing for work and also projects at home in the forest and with woodworking and things like that.
Wonderful. And it sounds like you are oh so busy, but are there any new projects in the pipeline that you can share?
Working on lately been working on a lot of television projects related to my books and articles, which are all in different stages of development for for limited series. So that has been occupying a lot of my time. And I have two book ideas that are both seedlings at the moment that I'm not quite ready to get into, but hopefully we'll be able to talk about those soon.
Wonderful. And finally, before I let you go, is there anything we haven't covered today that you want future readers to know?
No, just that I appreciate readers so much and that readers are the reason that we are here. So if your listeners do read the book, I would be delighted to hear from you and to hear what you think of it. And otherwise, I hope everybody has an amazing summer that is full of really great books.
Wonderful. What a great way to end. So, for all the listeners out there, be sure to pick up your copy of The Incorruptibles. I'm not kidding when I say Dan weaves a captivating and compelling narrative that will keep you turning the pages and will introduce you to a whole new set of characters that you may not know. So, thanks again, Dan.
Thank you so much.
All right, friends, there you have it. Again, a big thank you to Dan for coming on to talk about his work. I'll be sure to include Dan's social media information on the website at www.civicsandcoffee.com. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.